And so we now turn to the French Revolution, and this lecture, though focusing on the French Revolution, corresponding to the chapter on transatlantic revolutions, we have a video on the American Revolution. I think the textbook chapter does a very good job covering revolutions in the Americas in general. Kind of the common thread here is the influence of the Enlightenment, both in, kind of providing the raw material for articulating everything people found wrong with existing political and social systems, but also suggesting alternatives, ways to either reform or even completely replace existing political systems. So we're going to focus in this lecture on the French Revolution, in part because I think by looking at it a bit more in depth, we'll get a clearer picture of how this actually worked. But much of what we're discussing here does find a correspondence with respect to these other revolutions. So, French Revolution, often considered as having begun in 1789. So, just to kind of give us a bit of context here, looking at this map, getting a sense of what Europe looked like at this point. You'll note that we have no Germany or Italy in the center, still a large number of smaller states. East Europe looking very different. We do have a Kingdom of Poland, but you have the Habsburg Empire, sometimes referred to as the Austrian Empire. We have the Ottoman Empire in Southeast Europe. Western Europe looking a little bit more like the present-day map of Europe. We have the Kingdom of Spain, of Portugal, and of course the Kingdom of France and Great Britain. Right, so that is kind of setting the stage. Now, so even though we generally consider the French Revolution as beginning in 1789, in fact, on a specific date, July 14th, 1789, when the storming of the Bastille took place, and we'll be looking at that momentarily, but most historians recognize that revolutions of this proportion don't just spring up out of nowhere. So we tend to focus more on what we might call long-term factors or causes, and there is some consensus regarding what these are with respect to the French Revolution. So first of all, poor economic situation. Particularly in the years leading up to the revolution, you had a series of bad harvests. The price of food has gone up. People are literally starving to death, right? They're unable to put food on the table. And this is going to create, obviously, a great deal of discontent. Factor number two, unmanageable debt. And this has more to do with the French government. The French government, the national debt, has really hit a crisis point. The French government, in fact, finding it difficult to service the debt, difficult to fund the day-to-day functioning of government, and they're not really sure how to deal with that. So that is a second factor, and in some ways, kind of the most immediate factors we're going to see. Third, a growing resentment of the noble class. You might remember with Louis XIV, we see a kind of transformation where the nobles give up power for privilege, and there's kind of a growing perception, not without foundation, that the nobles are essentially useless. They do not provide any kind of productive service to France, whether in the government, which at this point the bureaucracy is made up primarily of members of the bourgeoisie, and they don't appear to do much productively and economically. That's not entirely true, but there is something to that assessment. Very often it seems they're more concerned with just having fancy balls and going off hunting and basically just having a good time and basically, living life high on the taxpayers' money. And that brings us to the final factor. They do not pay any taxes. That is the most important privilege that the nobles enjoy, right? So to sum it up, right, this kind of sense that they are spending a lot of the taxpayers' money, but not actually putting anything, into the system. And then finally, you have the growing influence of Enlightenment ideals, right? So providing kind of a way of not just articulating everything that you think is wrong with French society, but also suggesting ways in which you might remedy that, right? Alternatives in terms of how you might reform the political system and so forth. As you might imagine, the bourgeoisie, particularly the wealthier, wealthier commoners, are going to find these ideas very appealing, because very often the kind of reforms they would suggest would also correspond to enhancing their position politically and socially. Now, we might even add a fifth factor, and that would be the fact that during this period of crisis, we have a relatively ineffective ruler, Louis XVI, right? So, and the immediate crisis is how to deal with the debt. France deep in debt. And so, they're trying everything they can, borrowing money, raising taxes on commoners until the point that they literally have no more to give. Again, much of this reflected the fact that France had engaged in too many wars. And in fairness to Louis XVI, really more of the blame should probably go to Louis XIV and Louis XV, who basically had just spent money that France didn't have engaging in wars. Often in a very irrational manner. Though we can't let Louis XVI completely off the hook. More recently, he had provided military assistance to the American colonies in their war for independence. And this had really added to the national debt. Making matters worse, France didn't really get anything out of the final settlement. And let's be clear about this. The reason France assisted the American colonists had nothing to do with somehow supporting the ideals they were fighting for, or some kind of support for representative government. It was simply kind of the idea of sticking it to the British. But again, with the final settlement, the peace treaty ending the American Revolutionary War, which, by the way, was signed off on in Paris, France pretty much got nothing, right? So kind of made him look a bit foolish. The long and short of it is that at some point, Louis XVI is absolutely desperate for a new source for taxes. Again, they pretty much have squeezed the commoners dry. They really have nothing left to give. And at some point, Louis XVI is going to have to think the unthinkable, ending the tax exemption of the nobles, right? I mean, that they are going to have to be taxed. It would be based on land, of which they have plenty. And as you might imagine, right, the nobles, from their point of view, they had given up power for privilege. This is the most important privilege, and they are not prepared to relinquish that without a fight. So at some point, they insist that if he is going to do that, he must first reconvene the Estates General, and only if they agreed to new taxes would new taxation be legitimate. Otherwise, it would be illegitimate, right? So to remind you what this Estates General is, in theory, it is a national parliamentary body, not unlike the parliament in England at this point. The thing is, I say theoretically because while the institution was never abolished, it hasn't actually been called into session for roughly 170 years, right? So in principle, it still exists. But the way it works is the king, whoever he is, would have to actually convene the Estates General, so called because it has three components, each component representing one of the three estates. But it literally has not met in ages. And as you might imagine, Louis XVI is very reluctant to go down this path and will actually attempt to implement new taxes without the Estates General. But this is going to lead to massive resistance throughout France, and not just among the nobility. Even among commoners, this just feels as if the king is overstepping his bounds. So finally, the king agrees to convene the Estates General. And again, this body has not met in ages, not since 1614. In fact, it has been so long, no one even really knows how you go about convening it, how you determine who should be sitting on this body, should be acting as representatives, what the numbers should be, anything about the whole process. They actually have to look it up. They basically decide that they're going to follow the forms observed at its last meeting. But again, that's 1614. We are now in 1789, right? So that is over 170 years. But what they finally arrive at is that essentially it would mean an equal number of representatives for each estate, but each estate only having one collective vote. And I want you to think carefully about what that actually means. So let's imagine I don't remember the exact numbers, but let's imagine that each estate has 200 representatives. And generally speaking, we can expect all the representatives for the clergy, all the representatives for the nobles to vote the same way, likely often in opposition to the 200 representatives for the commoners, for the third estate. What that means is if they all have one collective vote, it's always going to be 2-1, right? So from the perspective of the third estate, they understand that they will have zero leverage, right? They can pretty much count, they might have been able to get a few individual votes from the clergy or from, even from the nobility. But if it's one collective vote for each one, that wouldn't matter. It will always be 2 votes to 1. And some of the more educated members of the third estate are not too happy about this, right? They kind of recognize almost immediately that, this is a really significant opportunity and one that will essentially be squandered in the sense that the third estate will have no leverage in whatever should proceed. And so kind of at the forefront of pushing back on this is going to be a body of liberal Parisians who call themselves the Committee of 30. And rather cleverly, they basically bring it down to a very simple demand, right? They demand a doubling of the third estate's representation. So, using the numbers we started with, that would mean 400 representatives versus 200 for the clergy, 200 for the nobility. And this is very important, voting by head. On the understanding that they probably could at least occasionally win over a few votes from representatives of the clergy and the nobility, right? So they would start out even, 400 versus, 400 collectively for the first and second estates. And then if you could kind of sway a few individuals, you might end up with a vote like, say, 420 versus 380, right? So at least you have that possibility. Well, the government indicates they are willing to double the representation of the third estate, but not concede voting by head, meaning effectively it would be a useless concession. I mean, if you really think about it, they could raise the number of representatives for the third estate to 1,000, but if they only have one collective vote, you're always going to end up with a vote of 2 versus 1. Even if you're able to gain the support of a few representatives from the other two states, it's never probably going to be the majority. So they're not happy about this. But at some point, we have to consider how representative is this body of Parisians. Well, first of all, I want to point out that when we're looking at the history of the French Revolution, and I should say the history of modern France, Paris is central to developments in France in a way that few capitals are. The one exception might be Cairo in Egypt. But, you can never talk about, historical developments in the United States, as somehow depending on what happens in Washington, D.C., or in Great Britain is depending on what happens in London. Paris is going to be very central. Whatever happens in Paris eventually radiates out to the rest of the country. More importantly, though, we should note that, we're starting to see an attempt at educating other members of the third estate, some of it through political cartoons like this poster we see here, kind of illustrating the idea of the third estate, shaking off his chains and rising up and, feeling his power. And, that would be the individual who is sitting on the ground. The other two obviously representing the first and second estates, looking very fearful, right? And the name of that cartoon, literally, political cartoon, Rise of the Third Estate. But more important, we're going to start to see the circulation of a large number of pamphlets arguing on behalf of the Third Estate. And pamphlets, they're easy, easy to produce very cheaply, to make mass printings of them. They tend to be very, kind of straight to the point, very concise, so easily digested. Even individuals who are illiterate, it wouldn't be too hard for someone to read a pamphlet to them and so forth. And they're going to prove especially impactful, very influential. None more so, however, than a pamphlet written by, oddly enough, a member of the clergy, a French abbé, but someone also very well versed in politics, so something of a statesman, and his name is Emmanuel Joseph Sayas. And he writes a pamphlet called "What is the Third Estate?" And this one really proves to be incredibly influential, right? Like somehow the argument made in this pamphlet is going to resonate with large numbers of commoners, and it effectively becomes the manifesto of the revolution, right? So he himself becomes like a major player in the revolution pretty much up until the time of Napoleon's coup, which we'll get to later, right? But he is one of the chief theorists of the French Revolution. And by the way, in a sense, this pamphlet's impact on the French Revolution very similar to another pamphlet's impact on the American Revolution, and that would be Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which, just to give you an idea of how impactful these pamphlets can be, many historians consider that pamphlet to have swayed up to a third of the colonists in America to support breaking away from Britain, right? To support outright independence, when many of them up until that point had been kind of sitting on the fence. But that's a different story. What about what is the Third Estate? So we're just going to look at kind of the introduction to that pamphlet, but I think it helps to illustrate what is the main argument being made there, right? So basically starts out with three questions with very succinct answers. Question number one: what is the Third Estate? Answer: everything, in the sense that they make up, first of all, demographically, something like 96% of the population, but also the idea that they are the ones who do all the living, the dying, the working, the generating of wealth, the people who work in government and so forth, right? So this kind of corresponds to the idea that the nobility are pretty useless, essentially parasites, also taking maybe a dim view of religion, so questioning the value of the Catholic Church. The Third Estate makes up everything. Question number two: what has it been up to now in the political order? Well, I think this is pretty clear: nothing. In spite of the fact that we make up the vast majority of France, numerically, in terms of what we bring to the table, we have had no political voice whatsoever. And then finally, what does it demand? To become something. And what I do want to highlight there, this is actually a fairly moderate demand. They're not demanding to become everything, just something. They should have some role, to be determined, to be negotiated. So the French Revolution at the beginning, fairly moderate, but that will change over time. In the meantime, the Estates General, once they finally work out the rules, they figure out how to determine who should be sitting in the Estates General. They finally convene on May 5th, 1789. And there we see them, probably more than 200 per estate. But in any event, almost from the start, we're going to have problems, primarily because the Third Estate's demand for voting by head has yet to be accepted, right? And in large measure because it is heavily resisted by the nobility and the vast majority of the clergy, right? They don't want to give up their privileged position in this sense. And at some point it becomes apparent that this demand is never going to be met, at which point on May 28th, Sayes, who is there as a representative of the clergy, but very often speaking on behalf of the Third Estate, moves that the Third Estate proceed on its own, right? Basically, we're going to get up, leave, find another place to meet, and we will move forward without the rest of you. You are invited to take part, but we're not going to wait for you. And shortly thereafter, they declare themselves the National Assembly, the true representatives of the French people, and they make it very clear: we are an assembly of people, not of estates. If you are becoming a part of the National Assembly, you are here simply as a fellow Frenchman, a representative of the French people. You are not here to represent the interests of your estate. And they also make it clear that the Assembly intends to conduct the nation's affairs with or without the other states. I want you to think about how bold a move this actually is. It would be as if a number of representatives in the House of Representatives in the United States just suddenly stood up, left the Capitol building, and just declared that henceforth we represent the United States government and we will proceed with the business of government, right? That might be perceived as a somewhat treasonous act. And certainly there are many, including the king, who are viewing what just happened here in a similar light. And so this is, really a very scary moment in a way. It's not clear how the king is going to respond. And, just to give you an idea, you kind of imagine that it was Louis XIV, probably would have sent the military in right away and just nipped this whole thing in the bud. But Louis XVI, as we discussed, a rather ineffective ruler. Well, ineffective largely because he's very indecisive. Second of all, probably never really wanted to be king. It's just didn't want that kind of responsibility, would be much happier going off on hunts, gaming with his noble buddies and so forth. He's not really up to dealing with this kind of confrontation. So what does Louis XVI do? Well, Louis XIV, as I mentioned, probably would have sent the military in, just how dare you, nip this whole thing in the bud. Louis XVI responds by ordering the closure of the Salle des Etats, the room where the assembly was meeting, which, I find just in my mind a rather comical image, right? You could imagine members of the assembly showing up. It's like, the doors are locked. Well, I guess we're done for. Might as well go home. But obviously that, one would not really anticipate they're reacting that way. What they do is, in fact, go to another room. They go to an indoor tennis court where they swear what comes to be known as the tennis court oath, because literally it takes place in a tennis court, that they will not separate until they had given France a constitution, right? So they've actually upped the ante, right? They have now made it very explicit. They intend to give France a new constitution, effectively a new government. Who knows if that would even include a king? And, this is actually in some ways the turning point. A majority of the representatives of the clergy at that point join them, as do 47 members of the nobility. Why exactly that happens? Well, there are a host of factors involved. Probably, some of them genuinely sympathetic to what they were fighting for. These kind of relevant Enlightenment ideas had been floating around for a while. People were familiar with them, had been discussing them. Some of them maybe just, kind of reading the writing on the wall. This is, where things are headed. Want to make sure I'm on the right side of that. But in any event, this is really a turning point. And now you really have to wonder, right? How is the king going to respond? And before we consider that, as you might imagine, the tennis court oath, a very important event for many French people. It's kind of a part of their history, and therefore often depicted artistically, as we see in this painting. And so the event took place on June 20th, 1789. By the way, we're getting very close to the day considered as marking the beginning of the revolution, July 14th, 1789. Do you feel the tension building, right? Something is going to happen. Well, from this point on, the National Assembly refers to itself as the National Constituent Assembly, beginning on July 9th. And they make it very clear that they are determined and committed to come up with a new constitution for France, and everyone wondering what will be the king's reaction. The king is in Versailles. No one's quite sure what he's thinking, but they do know that there are a large number of very conservative ministers with him. You have to imagine they might be encouraging him to take a harder line. So many are anticipating a royal coup. Again, that he's going to send the military in, just shut down this whole operation, arrest a whole bunch of people, and that will be the end of that. And so there's a growing concern that the National Constituent Assembly is under threat, and we start to see large demonstrations taking place in Paris. And at some point they start targeting government buildings, most famously the Bastille prison. and armory, actually. And at some point, tensions are building, things become violent. Insurgents seize the prison. A number of authority figures are killed along the way. The roughly 7 prisoners who were there are released. At that point, in a rather excited state, they march to the Hotel de Ville, killing a number of authority figures along the way. By the way, the Hotel de Ville, not a hotel, basically the town hall. And then march from there to the Palais Royal, which is the royal palace in Paris, today the Louvre Museum. So this all happens on July 14th, 1789, today celebrated as the beginning of the French Revolution. And, this is really, I suppose, the point of no return. From that point onward, there really is no going back. And from the other side, the king really now has to either take a, kind of decisive action or basically give up. And pretty much he goes with the latter. The king and his supporters almost immediately back down. In fairness, it's not an easy thing for a king to, sick the military on his own subjects. He's supposed to be kind of a father figure to his people, right? So, this is not an easy decision to make, but you have to wonder if it had been Louis XIV, if things would have gone differently. In any event, they back down. From this point forward, though, by the way, he's still king. It's not that he's been overthrown or anything. And in fact, we should note, at this point, the revolution is not directed against the king. If anything, really directed against the nobles. And, at this point, there's even, the idea that there might be a place for the king in a reformed France, right? I mean, if the National Assembly comes up with a new constitution, in theory, it could be a constitutional monarchy. In any event, the king even demonstrates sympathy for the revolution by accepting the symbol of it, the tricolor cockade. The colors being red, white, and blue, even until today. The colors associated with the French Revolution, by the way, not borrowed from the Americans, just to be clear. And very often presented as this kind of knot of ribbons or cockade that you might wear on a hat or, somewhere on your person as a way of demonstrating your support. And so now the king is demonstrating exactly that kind of support. Remember, some of this might just be, better just play along for now, maybe, secretly plotting some kind of response down the road. But this is an individual who never really wanted to be king anyway. And also familiar with, certain Enlightenment ideas. So, maybe also understanding that, the revolution's time had come. And many people, at this point had until now and continue to have a warm, kind of fuzzy feeling towards the king. So alongside cries of Vive la nation, Vive la révolution, we hear the cry of Vive le roi, long live the king. Feelings towards the nobility not so warm and fuzzy, and that becomes very apparent as the revolution spreads to the countryside in August. August defined by what's often referred to as la grande peur, or the great fear. And by this we mean the nobles' fear of the peasantry, because the peasantry is going to lay siege to them effectively, right? And this kind of starts in part because rumors begin to spread among the peasantry that the nobles have begun hiring brigands, as kind of road bandits, mercenaries to march on villages to destroy the peasants' new harvest. And that results in what we might call a kind of preemptive strike by the peasantry, where they begin to ransack the chateau or palaces of the nobles. More importantly, they collect any records of whatever feudal obligations they might have to the nobles, any documentation of that, and destroy it. They set it to flame, even as they compel the nobles to renounce their feudal rights, effectively ending whatever remnants of feudalism remained in France up until then. Now, some nobles were sympathetic, at least at this point, to what the revolution represented, right? Kind of, they were familiar with some of the Enlightenment ideals that informed it, maybe kind of a recognition that, there was a kind of justice to this. Of course, not all nobles felt that way, and we're going to start to see some nobles fleeing the country that we end up referring to as the émigré, right? Kind of immigrating or emigrating out of France, leaving their property behind. But don't worry, they will not be without resources wherever they relocate. And primarily they relocate in the various capitals of Europe, where almost immediately they begin agitating for a European coalition against revolutionary France, right? So they're agitating among their fellow nobles, among royalty. And as you might imagine, right, news of the French Revolution is spreading rapidly. Their basic argument is this: do not believe for a second that the revolution is going to stop at the border. Whatever happens in France is a harbinger of things to come in your country. And this is just going to lead to civil disturbances, unrest, and a complete overturning of the social and political order. Well, in the meantime, again, the National Assembly's primary purpose is to come up with a new constitution, but in the meantime, they are in effect a kind of interim government, and they are going to start legislating, beginning with the August decrees, which basically formally eliminate whatever remaining vestiges there were of the three-estate system of feudalism. And the nobility and the clergy, I mean, they definitely understand that, this is a done deal. They agree to surrender their privileges and to formally abolish feudalism, meaning that the nobles give up their seigneurial rights, right, the second estate, and, any of the rights that they enjoyed as nobles, particularly as lords of large landed estates with loads of peasants. And the clergy give up the right to gather tithes, which were, in effect, from the point of view of a commoner, almost like just one more tax that they had to pay to the church. And speaking of the church, we should note that moving forward, the National Assembly is really going to target the church. And some of this does reflect that, remember, for Enlightenment thinkers, the Catholic Church was public enemy number one, right? Very often perceived as the thing holding people back. We talked about Immanuel Kant, the idea that in some ways the church was the chief culprit in preventing people from using their own reason and so forth. So they're really going to produce a lot of legislation against the church in the following year, in 1790. Right, so first of all, the clergy's special privileges, whatever they are, canceled. Second, the church's right to levy a tax on crops, in addition to tithing, right? So another tax, effectively, on the peasantry, the dime, is abolished. Church property is confiscated. It now belongs to the state, and that is an incredible source of wealth. Remembering that a chief factor leading to the French Revolution was the French government's debt. And then finally, the clergy will be transformed into employees of the state, which, by the way, is effectively how it works today. If you're a priest or a monk, somehow affiliated with the clergy in France today, you are in effect a state employee. And kind of related to that, the idea that your primary loyalty is not to the church, not to God, but to the state. And that's going to be an issue further down the road. In the meantime, though, there is still this question of what kind of constitution, what kind of government are we going to have? And the members of the National Assembly very quickly become divided around that issue. And I don't expect you to remember any of the details provided in this particular slide, certainly not any of the names. Maybe the Abbé Sieyès, who has kind of emerged as in a kind of leadership position, and he ends up sitting in the middle, but that actually reflects more his position on what kind of government France should have. The reason I kind of set things up the way I did is to kind of illustrate something that I think you might find interesting, right? It's really interesting today when we talk about our politics, we often indicate that we're either to the left or to the right. Regardless of the issue, there's always kind of the idea, if you're to the left, you hold this position. If you're to the right, you hold that position. And, if you really think about it, that doesn't make any sense, right? Left and right are about directions. Like you go down to the corner, turn left, go 2 blocks, turn right. What does this have to do with politics? Well, this way of talking about your political position actually comes from the French Revolution and the way in which the National Assembly was set up, right? So the main dividing point at this time with regard to what kind of government we want is, should it be a constitutional monarchy, kind of like what they have in Britain, where you have a king, but who is subject to the law and has to work with some kind of representative body? Or do we want a republic, right, where there is no king, there is an elected executive figure, which is what we have in the United States, or, it could take a different form, but there's no king. Where you sat in the National Assembly depended on what your position was on that issue, right? So the further to the right you sat, the more strongly you supported constitutional monarchy, and probably the stronger you felt the powers of the king should be. The further to the left you sat, the more committed you were to a republic, and if you sat somewhere in the middle, it probably meant you were more open to compromise. Hence why the Abbé is sitting in the middle, right? And in a way, the fact that he has kind of a leadership position also indicates that at this point, the prevailing tone of debate, and in the sense of people being willing to compromise, is one of moderation, right? Most of the members of the National Assembly at this point, members of the bourgeoisie, many of them are like lawyers, individuals who have property, maybe don't want to see the revolution get completely out of hand, right? So to some degree open to a constitutional monarchy, but clearly not everyone agrees. Well, before coming up with a new form of government, they decide, why don't we define the principles upon which it should be based, right? And these principles would, for the most part, reflect Enlightenment ideals. And so they end up producing a document that will end up being one of the most important and influential documents ever produced in the history of humankind, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, promulgated on August 26th, 1789. Now, it does consist of more than 3 points, such as we have outlined here, but I think the first 3 give a pretty clear indication of what it's about. So, number 1, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Well, that comes straight out of the Enlightenment, right? That all men are inherently equal. We find similar language to that in the Declaration of Independence. The second part I find is a little bit more specific to France. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good, which is essentially to reject what had defined the social order until then, right? This idea of 3 estates where where you fit into society was defined by your birth, right? That is being, in a very specific way, rejected here. Number 2, the aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Well, again, I think this one very clearly coming out of the Enlightenment. Again, we find similar language in the Declaration of Independence, which precedes this, by the way, right? The idea of, God-given inalienable rights, maybe, somewhat different language, but same basic idea. I would like to highlight here that they actually specifically talk about property, to some degree, again, reflecting the fact that at this point, it is the bourgeoisie who are basically at the vanguard of the revolution, people of property who want to preserve their property. And then finally, number 3, the principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body nor individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation, right? This is actually where, where they're kind of defining things a bit differently than will be the case in the American Revolution, right? American Revolution, kind of emphasizing more individual rights. It's kind of more the idea of, finding a way for individuals to negotiate their own respective pursuits of happiness and so forth. This one emphasizing a bit more the welfare of the community, right? And I mean, both are evident in both revolutions, it's more a matter of emphasis, right? So, American Revolution kind of emphasizing more the welfare of the individual, i.e., the individual's pursuit of happiness. French Revolution emphasizing a bit more the collective welfare. But again, I mean, both are evident in both cases. But that now brings us to, at some point they can't put it off any longer. What form of government are we going to have? And they finally settle on constitutional monarchy with a unicameral, i.e., one representative body, assembly, right? Like United States is bicameral. We have a Senate, House of Representatives. They will have one, and they will have a king, right? But it will be a pretty weak king. The king would have what's known as a suspensive veto on legislation, right? So in the American system, the president has a proper veto, right? If the Congress produces a bill that they want to have signed into law, the president can veto it, but of course the Congress can override it if it gets enough votes. But it's quite a lot of votes, right? So I mean, this is a pretty powerful mechanism that the president can deploy. Suspensive veto means basically the king can only send it back to the assembly where, if they decide, well, okay, we appreciate that you're not happy with it, but we're going to vote on it anyway, and that would be it, right? So really all the king can do is delay the implementation of a law, but not block it absolutely the way an American president could be, right? So that also means you have a rather weak executive branch. And this is going, what they came up with, this form of government, is going to leave pretty much everyone unsatisfied, right? Those supporting monarchy, constitutional monarchy, many of them wanted a much stronger king. They think this, among other things, is going to make France weak in terms of its relations with other nations. So they're not happy about this. They oppose this scheme. And then, those who wanted a republic, they're not happy about having a king at all. And part of this actually is, not just in principle, they really aren't happy about having Louis XVI as a king because they simply don't trust him. They just don't trust that he is committed to the revolution. Part of this because, for the most part, he's off in Versailles. Who the heck knows what's going on there? What is he thinking? Who he's talking to? And so, the fact that they have now proposed a constitutional monarchy is actually going to lead to demonstrations, which at some point evolve into what's known as the March of the Women, which takes place on October 5th, 1789, where a large number of Parisian women march on to Versailles with the National Guard behind them, about 20,000 members, ostensibly there just to maintain order, but they also are strong proponents of the revolution. And they show up there to persuade the king and his family to come back to Paris. And by persuade, I mean they act in a very intimidating way and make it clear that if he doesn't come back to Paris, things are not going to go well. But in the end, the king and his family do relocate to Paris, where they take up residency at the Royal Palais, or the Tuileries. But in any event, I mean, as you might imagine, this was a rather intimidating moment for the king, kind of reminiscent of when the peasants way back when had broken into the bedroom of Louis XIV when he was 5, but maybe more serious. I don't know if some of you saw a few years back a movie came out on Marie Antoinette with Kirsten Dunst, I think, in the lead role, if I remember correctly. The movie actually ends with this episode, right, as the royal family is taken away from Versailles. And the very last scene in the film is Marie Antoinette looking longingly at the gardens of Versailles, which she shall never see again. Well, in the meantime, the French revolutionary government is still, by the way, this interim government, I mean, they still have to have elections and whatnot, has finally resolved the financial crisis. December 2nd, 1789, a law is passed by which all church assets are turned over to the nation, i.e. the state, and that provides a collateral for a new paper currency, the assignat, which they then use to pay off the debt, right? The collateral, of course, being the confiscated church lands. But they're not done with the church yet. And, really it's kind of hard to overestimate just how hostile the revolution was to the Catholic Church. On February 13th, 1790, a law is passed abolishing monastic vows. Think about that for a second, right? You became a monk because you wanted to dedicate yourself to God, and the way you would demonstrate that is by taking a vow, a promise to God. That is now illegal. July 12th, 1790, the civil constitution of the clergy is promulgated, at which point the church is formally and completely brought under state control, related to which the clergy are required to take an oath of loyalty to the civil constitution. Think about that, right? So you can't pledge yourself to God, but you must pledge yourself to this new constitution, which basically is a way of demonstrating your loyalty to the state. And many clergy walk out of the National Assembly. Well, it's around this time that we arrive at the first anniversary of the French Revolution. So right from the start, the storming of the Bastille considered as the defining moment. And so there are celebrations across France, particularly in Paris, on July 14th, 1790. Probably the most important celebration would be at the Champ de Mars, which is basically the Field of Mars, which you see here, a very large open space. And so huge numbers of people gather there to celebrate the anniversary of the fall of the Bastille. And among the participants are the king and the royal family. So, on the face of it at this point, a really kind of big kumbaya moment. Looks like everyone's basically on the same page. But in fact, really what we see here is kind of a papering over of growing divisions. And it's not really just between, say, the nobility and commoners. Large numbers of people in France, many of them commoners, are beginning to think maybe the revolution is going too far. And probably one really divisive development is, this continued targeting of the Catholic Church. This kind of, a lot of Frenchmen, they certainly support going after the nobility, doing away with feudalism and so forth. But many of them are very Catholic, and they're not too happy with how far the revolution has gone, in stripping away the church of its independence, this idea of forbidding monastic vows and so forth. So there is kind of growing polarization. Things become worse when, now that they're done with the church, the National Assembly begins to go after the nobility, and in this case, seeking to abolish any symbolic paraphernalia connected with the Ancien Régime, i.e. this term invented during the French Revolution, referring to pre-revolutionary France, the old order, right? So we're talking about armorial bearings, liveries, and so forth. And for a lot of nobles, this is just too much. It's like, fine, you took away our status, you took away some of our wealth. We didn't have a lot of political power until now, but that whatever we had is gone. But now, why are you going after these symbols, which allow us to take pride in our family legacies and so forth? And the National Assembly would be like, what's the big deal? They're just symbols. And the nobles would be like, exactly, they're just symbols. Why not leave well enough alone? And then they become even further upset with a new military code that basically allows commoners to become officers. Right? During the Ancien Régime, the pre-revolutionary France, you had to be a noble to become an officer. That is no longer the case. And all of this is going to see an increasing number of nobles joining the ranks of the émigrés, right? These nobles who are fleeing France, headed off to other capitals, and importantly, agitating for the various powers of Europe to form a coalition against revolutionary France. By the way, we should note that this new military code will eventually work to the advantage of France. Certain individuals, such as Napoleon Bonaparte, never could have become officers otherwise, right? But at the time, this is not how the nobles saw it. And we're going to also start seeing counter-revolutionary activity throughout France, right? People who are now beginning to actively oppose the revolution. And again, some of them, it's not just nobles. You have a fair number of peasants who feel that the revolution has simply gone too far. Meanwhile, those on the left who never wanted a constitutional monarchy to begin with are going to become more and more extreme, right? They feel the revolution has not gone far enough. So nobody is happy, right? Things are becoming, again, much more polarized. Probably the defining element on the left is going to be the Jacobins, right? Which is, in a sense, a political faction and also the name of a political club with many branches throughout France where like-minded individuals can gather. And so it's against this backdrop that Louis XVI does what probably is the worst possible thing he could have done. He tries to run away. On June 20th, the royal family fled the Tuileries in Paris, and they did it disguised as servants, right? So not just simply that they ran away, but they did it in a cowardly fashion. And unfortunately for them, in spite of the costumes, they are recognized, right? So the next day, June 21st, they are arrested at the city of Varennes in the northeast of France. Hence why we often refer to this episode as the flight to Varennes. That wasn't where they were trying to get. They just didn't get any further. And they are brought back to Paris under guard. Now, this is really going to create a problem for the Assembly. They have just promulgated a new constitution based on constitutional monarchy, and now they have a king who behaved in a treasonous fashion. And, you know, Louis, they don't know what to do. They're like, this is what we came up with. He's the king. We're stuck. We kind of have to go with that, but we don't trust him. The king is like, you know, I swear it was a mistake. I just lost my head for a second. I'm here. I'm with you. But, you know, those who oppose constitutional monarchy, from their point of view, this, you know, pretty much proved their case. He cannot be trusted. But again, this is what they have. And so they move forward with it. Louis XVI swears an oath to the Constitution. Think about this. The king swears an oath not to make war upon the nation or allow anyone to do so in his name. I'm just saying you're in big trouble if you need the king or the president or whoever the top executive figure is to promise not to attack his own country. Right? I mean, that's, you know, if you feel you got to do that, you might have a problem. And certainly Republicans, right, those who favored a republic, were against monarchy, see it that way, right? They begin drafting a petition calling for Louis XVI's abdication in light of his flight. We start to see massive demonstrations taking place. One really large one takes place in the Champ de Mars, where they denounce the king. At some point, the National Guard comes in. Shots are fired. I think something like 50 people end up being killed. It's kind of like a much larger scale Boston massacre. And eventually, people flee to their respective corners, right? Some of the leading, more fiery Republican speakers, they just kind of go into hiding. Patriotic clubs and radical newspapers are shut down. And almost immediately, France is becoming completely divided. And then, making matters worse, comes the Declaration of Pillnitz, issued by the rulers of Europe, along with one of the émigrés who happens to be the king's brother, Charles Philippe, the Comte d'Artois. Now, if you're Louis XVI, who is desperately trying to prove that you are still loyal to the revolution, having your brother issue a statement with a number of different rulers basically condemning the revolution is not helping. So, more specifically, the Declaration of Pillnitz demands the total liberty of Louis XVI, the dissolution of the Assembly, and they promise to invade France if their conditions are refused. Again, if you're Louis XVI, this is not helping. It only makes his position worse and raises further suspicions, makes the Republican case seem all the more compelling. And it's around this time that we see one individual emerge as the leading figure on the left, Maximilien Robespierre, who at this point, so they have a new constitution. He's like, okay, we have elections coming for a new legislative assembly. Robespierre motions that members of the National Constituent Assembly not be allowed to sit on the legislative assembly. Right? They should not be allowed to run for this new legislative body. And at the end of the day, his motion is carried. He wins the day. What this means is all these moderate individuals that until then were pretty much in the driver's seat, right? Members of the National Assembly cannot be part of this new legislative assembly. And it ends up being dominated by members of the left and Robespierre in particular. And, Robespierre, he is not someone open to compromise. He was known as the incorruptible. It was either his way or the highway. And, this is something that some found admirable, right? That he was devoted to revolutionary political change, right? To the values of the Enlightenment. That he's someone who definitely could not be bribed, could not be bought, was not motivated by self-interest. On the other hand, individuals like that can be very dangerous, right? Anyone, for him, it's like either you are 100% on board with my position or you are the enemy. There is no shades of gray. There is no in between, right? People who are like mostly on board, then people who are totally against, right? If you're not 100% on board, you're all totally against and have to be dealt with harshly. So, what do we have? A new legislative assembly dominated by the Jacobins, radicals who are opposed to monarchy, who have to work with the king, who nobody trusts. Well, they make a go of it, shall we say. The legislative assembly comes up with legislation threatening the émigrés with death. He's like, kind of sentence of death in absentia. But if we were to catch you, inasmuch as you fled France, you agitated for war against France, you are a traitor and would be subject to death. The king vetoes this legislation. Well, he felt it was just a bit too harsh. He needed to understand, maybe they had panicked. Wouldn't reconciliation be a better way to go? But for those on the left who now dominate the Legislative Assembly, this is taken as further evidence that Louis XVI does not fully support the revolution. He then vetoes a decree, right, a further legislation, that those clergymen refusing to take the civic oath mandated by the civil constitution of the clergy should be compelled to do so on pain of arrest, right? That if they refuse to do so, they should be thrown into prison. Again, the king vetoes this legislation. Again, this is seen as further evidence that he is a traitor to the revolution. Remember, Robespierre, either you're fully on board or you're the enemy. And, in fairness, I'm not sure Louis XVI could have done anything that would have convinced him of his support for the French Revolution, but clearly this is not going to reflect well on Louis XVI from the point of view of Robespierre and those who follow him. And then finally, war breaks out. Though it is France that actually declares war, in this case on Austria, though partly because war is imminent. This happens on April 20th, 1792. Almost immediately, Prussia is going to join on the side of Austria. And before long, most of Europe is going to be united in opposition to France. And with the outbreak of war, basically all hell breaks loose back in Paris. Mainly headed up by the Paris Commune, we didn't really talk about them, but this kind of informal kind of governmental body that had actually taken shape at the beginning of the revolution, but in many ways dominated by Jacobins, by kind of the more radical element, and sometimes prone to become a mob. The Paris Commune is going to unleash, shall we say, this kind of mob element in Paris. And among other things, they will storm the Tuileries, the royal residency of the royal family, and take them prisoner. And this will also see the end of the Legislative Assembly. So the Paris Commune effectively becomes almost Robespierre's personal army in the street of Paris. They are under his control. He sends gangs of assassins at this point into the prisons to butcher up to 1,400 victims, supposedly because they are political enemies of revolutionary France. But you have to think a lot of scores were settled along the way. In the meantime, the assembly, unable to offer resistance, is dissolved. And in its place, we have a new body called the Convention, which convenes for the first time on September 20th, 1792. And one really powerful indication of just how radical the revolution has become at this point is they decide to create a new calendar, right? A new French revolutionary calendar, and this will be year one on that calendar. And there's probably no, more powerful way to demonstrate a desire to break with everything that had existed up until that point, right? Including, of course, the monarchy, which is abolished. France is now declared a republic with Robespierre in charge. And so, Louis XVI is in prison with his family, life hanging by a thread. And then, I'm sure they meant well, God bless their hearts, but the rulers of Europe did probably the worst thing they could do with respect to the fate of Louis XVI. They issued the Brunswick Manifesto, threatening retaliation on the French if they so much as harm a hair on the head of Louis XVI. And I even imagine that Louis XVI, by the way, there is no historical evidence that he was somehow collaborating with the rulers of Europe. I have to imagine that when word got to him about the Brunswick Manifesto, it's just like, put a fork in me, turn me over, I'm done. This is taken as the final proof of Louis XVI's treason, and after a very short trial, he is sentenced to death. His execution taking place via guillotine on January 21st, 1793. I think we all know what a guillotine is. Basically considered to be a humane way of relieving a person of their head. Shortly after that, Marie Antoinette, his wife, will be executed as well. And I should note, she was, for much of her time in France, maybe the most hated individual, particularly among the commoners. Some of you might be familiar with this phrase attributed to her that when told that the peasants were starving, she replied, well, if they don't have bread, let them eat cake. Supposedly meant, as a sincere gesture of concern that, well, if they ran out of bread, surely they must have cake in the cupboard. Most historians are pretty sure she didn't say this, but let's just say it was conceivable that she might have. It certainly would have reflected her attitude towards the majority of commoners, the peasantry in particular, the fact that she, a sense of disconnectedness with their suffering and so forth. But by the way, even those who hated her begrudgingly acknowledged that she held herself remarkably well in her final days, right? I mean, that she behaved in a very dignified way. By the way, the drawing on the right is an actual drawing made of her shortly before her execution. And, I love this kind of comparison between, her shortly before her death and, how she looked back in the glory days, right? So, oh, how the mighty have fallen. In the meantime, it becomes mob rule in Paris. On June 2nd, 1793, the Jacobins seize control of the convention with the help of the mob. And now they're going after anyone perceived as not being fully on board with the revolution. And that will include even moderate left deputies who are arrested and accused of counter-revolutionary activities. Simply this idea that they are just not fully enough committed to the revolution. So you effectively now have an alliance between the Jacobins and the mob. Very often these individuals in the street referring to themselves as sans culotte, meaning without socks, as in these long stockings that the aristocracy often wore, which oddly enough Robespierre himself wore. It's one of kind of the quirks of his personality that even though he was fully committed to the revolution, he liked to dress as an aristocrat. But in any event, this alliance becomes the basis of the new government, which is completely dominated by Robespierre. And related to that, we're going to see a growing radicalism, So you end up with basically a government dominated by two bodies, formed beginning with the formation on April 6th, 1793, of a Committee of Public Safety, and then alongside that, a Committee of General Security, uh, both of which are dominated by Robespierre. And another very important body that we should note, which is actually created prior to this, a revolutionary tribunal or court, which is established in Paris with one purpose only: to eliminate anyone considered to be a traitor to the cause of the revolution. And this will mark the beginning of the Reign of Terror, which will last between September 5th, 1793, until July 27th, 1794. So this is a rather lengthy period of time. And basically, its purpose was to defend the revolution against internal and external enemies. There really was this feeling of, our revolution, our cause is under siege, right? We're at war with the rest of Europe. Pretty clear who the enemy abroad is. But what do we do about the enemy in our midst, right? There are too many people within France who are not fully supportive of the revolution, and we need to weed them out, right? So first of all, civil liberties are suspended, right? This is, in a sense, going to evolve into an assembly line of death. We don't have time for adhering to, principles like innocent until proven guilty and so forth, that there should be a proper trial. So it's kind of funny. They're actually, ignoring principles of the Enlightenment in the name of supporting a revolution based on the principles of the Enlightenment, right? But, it's considered to be necessary, necessary evil in order to ensure that the revolution succeeds, right? So first of all, every individual should take a deep look within them, right? Individuals were expected to purge within themselves any anti-revolutionary tendency, right? But then, beyond that, we need to be on the lookout for anyone we suspect of not being fully supportive of the revolution. The problem is, almost anything could be an indication that you were somehow not sufficiently supportive. So, for instance, people who seem too zealous, perhaps they're hiding something, right? Someone who would appear to be too supportive of the revolution might be dangerous. Oh, by the way, though, this would be a good way for Robespierre to eliminate any potential rivals, right? Certainly anyone who did not seem fully committed to the revolution, right? Somebody who maybe was moved by compassion or too sympathetic might be deemed somehow insufficiently supportive of the revolution, right? Trials would be very short, right? They were perfunctory. The trials might last as long as, say, 5 to 10 minutes. Determination of guilt, could be just simply on a hunch. Very often there was very little rhyme or reason as to why one person was found guilty, another not. What's pretty clear, very often, again, people settling scores, right? If I had a quarrel with my neighbor, I might just go and report on him. This is going to be a very scary period to be in France, right? Trials perfunctory, guilt usually determined within minutes. But as you might imagine, at some point, people are going to turn on Robespierre. Things just get completely out of hand. And, as often happens, if the pendulum swings too far in one direction, at some point there is a counter reaction. In this case, the Thermidorian reaction, so named because it takes place during the revolutionary month of Thermidor, right? This revolutionary calendar, which, by the way, it doesn't just begin with year one, right, but actually is constructed in an entirely different way with, different names for different months, weeks that last 10 days, and so forth. So eventually, members of the convention are going to turn against Robespierre, who they then arrest, and eventually, shall we say, he who lives by the guillotine dies by the guillotine. He is executed. At that point, it's a bit of payback time. All Jacobin clubs are immediately banned, and many of its members are executed in what is sometimes referred to as the White Terror. By the way, this term terror, right, the way we use the term terror today when we talk about terrorism, right, political terror, comes from the French Revolution, right? It's kind of the idea that it's the same basic phenomena, right? That what they were doing was creating a climate of fear and terror by what often appeared the indiscriminate and random killing of individuals. In any event, with the Thermidorian reaction, a new constitution is promulgated on August 17th, 1795. They keep the revolutionary calendar, so this is year 3 of the revolution, and it goes into effect a little bit later that year on September 26th, 1795. And this new government, known as the Executive Directory, or sometimes just the Directory, is going to be somewhat conservative, or that's how we'd characterize it from our present day perspective. Kind of in reaction to the excesses of the Reign of Terror, which for many seem kind of a period of mob rule. We need to ensure that kind of thing can't happen again, to kind of safeguard against that. And so this new government is going to be dominated by the wealthiest people in France, those with property. In other words, if you don't have a significant amount of property, you don't have access to political office, you can't vote. So we're going to end up with basically a government dominated by between 5 and 10% of the wealthiest people in France. Structurally, it's going to consist of a bicameral legislature. The two bodies are Les Conseils des 500, the Council of the 500, consisting of 500 representatives, and then Les Conseils des Anciens, the Council of Elders, made up of 250 senators, and probably most important will be the executive body, made up of 5 appointed directors. The point I want to make here, and this is kind of, something to leave you with, imagine that you were, a Frenchman who had supported the French Revolution from the beginning, and you're like, really? This is what we fought for? A government dominated by, just a small segment of the population? So, okay, fine. Instead of nobles, it's about wealth. But surely this is not what the whole thing was about, right? And so there's going to be a kind of growing discontent with the Directory. I mean, initially people are just happy to establish order, but at some point, really a feeling of disappointment, and this is going to create the space for an individual to eventually, let's say an individual with access to military resources, an individual who enjoyed tremendous popularity, to seize power. And I think you all know who I'm talking about, but we'll leave it at that and conclude part 1 of our lecture here.